So we're talking about the sports thing first. Sports thing. All right. So it was all sports leagues except for the NHL, which actually suspended their playoffs. I think. No, did they suspend anything? First one they did. Yeah. So NHL suspended postponed games till Saturday, which is hilarious to me. Like that's actually shocking, but I know for a fact there are a lot of hockey players who are pretty either pro-Trump or just ignorant. Because a lot of them aren't even Americans, so I don't really think they understand.
Well, there's some who are critical of the NHL for not doing anything.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely – yeah. I mean, when was it – I think I was talking to Clarissa about it, and she was shocked that baseball, did what they did.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, well, it's bound to happen eventually, but good point. But I was like, I think the one thing that would shock me is if the NHL had a player-led, protest or strike. Sorry, strike's the right term for it. If there was a player-led strike in the NHL, that would shock me. But the baseball players, not necessarily were shocking, just because I know that even though it's predominantly white sport, baseball has been a huge part of, I guess, breaking barriers or race in America. And also I think that as of lately, there have been a few more people in baseball who have slowly taken a stand or taken a knee and everything like that. So it doesn't surprise me as much. But I'd be shocked if NHL ever had a strike led by the players over race and injustice. But yeah, that's just me. Okay, cool. So, hey everyone, welcome to this episode of What We Missed in School, Educate and Inform. Today, we're going to be talking about sports and its intersectionality with politics, specifically with what it has to do with race. Dad, I know you have a few favorite athlete sports moments and or, I guess, tidbits of information regarding the intersectionality of the two. Would you like to start wherever you feel is best?
Okay, well, I guess I'll start really with Jack Johnson. And he was a heavyweight champ back in the 20th century, 110, 112 years ago. And Johnson, understand here, is not a civil rights activist, so I'm not going to go in that direction. However, having said all that, though, he did endure a lot of racism. And when he won the heavyweight title, there was a concerted effort to find someone to fight him who was white and defeat him. And that person became Jim Jeffries. Jeffries had retired. He was a former heavyweight champ of the world. He's a big guy, like 6'6", about 250 pounds or so. And as I said, he retired undefeated. There was a tournament to replace Jeffries as the champion, and a Canadian named Tommy Burns ended up winning the title. And then Jack Johnson in Australia, of all places, defeated Burns for the title, and so he became the heavyweight champ. So this, of course, upset many white Americans, and so they were able to talk Jeffries to come out of retirement, take on Jack Johnson. And so Jeffries, by this time, was had gone to the stage acting. His weight had ballooned over 300 pounds. And so he agreed to come out of retirement to take on Johnson. Jeffries trained diligently and got his weight down to about 260 or so in time for the fight. But Johnson pretty much dominated Jeffries and won the fight. So as a result of that fight, which was going to be shown in movie theaters, and the fight was filmed, and the film was still relatively new in those days. The fight was filmed with the idea of showing in movie theaters, anticipating a Jeffries victory. Of course, Johnson won, and the fight was never shown in movie theaters, but riots did take place, where in various cities, Atlanta among many, whites went to black neighborhoods and rioted and destroyed property owned by black people out of anger of of Johnson's victory over Jeffries, because this fight been billed as a race to restore the white man to the top. And even then, although boxing was relatively new as a sport that was allowed to fight, because it was pretty much underground for a long period of time, this fight was billed, again, as a fight to restore the white man's supremacy, at least as far as athletics are concerned. So Johnson's victory certainly upset a lot of people. So when Joe Louis came along, some 25 years later, he had to be very careful with how he conducted himself. Jack Johnson was a very arrogant man. He did something that upset a lot of people, white and black, and that is that he consorted with white women. And indeed, a Congress passed a law called the Mann Act, M-A-N-N Act, which made it illegal to transport women across state lines for immoral purposes. And this act was aimed directly at Jack Johnson, who promptly flouted the law, took a woman into Indiana. He lived in Chicago, took a woman into Indiana for a few days of pleasure with her. He was then arrested and charged with violating the Mann Act. So, but again, Johns was quite arrogant. I'll give you an example of his arrogance and the type of person that he was. One day he was in his car and he was speeding. He was stopped by the police, and when he asked the cop how much was the fine for speeding, and the policeman pulled a number out of the air, said $50, $50 fine for speeding. So Jack Johnson gave him a $100 bill, or gave him $100 anyway, and said, "I'm coming back this way too." So that was Jack Johnson. And so when Joe Louis came along in the 1930s, he and his managers sort of made it a point to make sure that he was not going to be Jack Johnson. So he had to be humble. He could not. They made a point to make sure that he was not seen in pictures, taking pictures with white women in them. Certainly, Louis did have his affairs with white women, but they all kept very quiet, whereas Johnson tended to flaunt women in his life. And when Louis lost his first fight to Max Schmeling in 1935, most white Americans wanted a Schmeling victory. But a few years later, when they had their rematch at Yankee Stadium, things had changed. People had begun to realize that Adolf Hitler was, someone that who may be a little bit scary, if you will. And so, and both countries viewed this fight as one in which it would sort of, again, reestablish or establish one country or other as superior. Hitler certainly viewed it that way, and President Franklin Roosevelt understood that. And at one point, Roosevelt met with Louis at the White House, and he told Louis he has to win this fight. You have to win this fight. And so the way things happened, Louis knocked Schmeling out in the first round. And so he, along with Jesse Owens, became America's two biggest athletic heroes of that period. Owens, of course, having won those gold medals in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, and of course Louis having defeated Max Schmeling, and then going on to remain champion for pretty much a decade. And certainly Joe Louis became an iconic figure to the entire country, white and black, as he did many things for servicemen and servicewomen and the wives of servicemen during World War II. So therefore, so Louis really was a person who was quite iconic. Unbeknownst to a lot of people, though, was that Louis was in the military during the war. Many people understand that, but he fought his title fight as a serviceman. But at the same time, he also secretly reported to the Secretary of State, to various civil rights leaders about injustices he saw in the military. And so many people were unaware of what he was doing. But that's exactly what Lewis was doing. He was making sure that people were treated fairly while in the military, and he was in a very special position to do so. So Lewis was involved in a lot of activities that was civil rights behind the scenes. When you get into the 1950s, is actually fairly quiet. We get to the 1960s, which is by far the most turbulent decade in American history, dating back to the Civil War. You had a lot of things going on. You had the civil rights movement, you had the women's movement, gay rights are starting to come about here. You had the war in Vietnam and issues there. You had race riots as well. And so this country was going through an extremely turbulent period in that decade. Then of course you have assassinations of Kennedy and King and Malcolm X. And so both Kennedys, the president and his brother, the attorney general, former attorney general. So you have a problem here where people were, this country was in great turmoil during that period of time. But this also began the period really of public Black activism by athletes. Jim Brown, Bill Russell, Muhammad Ali were probably the most important people when it came to political activity during the 1960s. Brown was involved in a venture with your grandfather, something called the Black Economic Union, in which they put up money to help Black people start businesses. But Brown also became quite active politically in other areas as well. Same thing with Bill Russell. And when it came to Muhammad Ali and his refusal to be inducted to join the military, Brown and Russell were his most visible supporters here. So Black athletes really sort of took the lead because they had to when it came to politics. They had a small forum, certainly not like today, but they certainly had a forum in those days. And then, of course, you have the 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico City, where many Black athletes boycotted. The United States could have sent the greatest basketball team ever assembled, probably, up that period of time, to the Mexico Olympics, led by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. But he boycotted the Olympics, as did many other Black athletes in basketball and other sports. But still, the Americans did well, and Black athletes did participate, and the U.S. basketball team still won the gold medal. But the 68 Olympics will always be remembered for the 200 meters, I believe it was 200 meter race that involved John Carlos and Tommy Smith, who, I forgot who won the race. I believe Carlos won it and Smith finished third. And an Australian, here's Australia again, Peter Norman finished second. And Carlos and Smith, who today are not close friends, they're just opposites personality-wise, decided to go ahead and do some sort of protest involving Black gloves, but they only had one pair of Black gloves where they're going to raise their fists in the air, and they only had one pair rather than two pairs. So it's Peter Norman of Australia who suggested actually that you put one on your right hand, you put one on your left hand. And they thought it was a great idea. And so the Black Power symbol with the fists in the air as the national anthem is being played. It's still an iconic photo if you take a look at it sometime. What is unknown to many Americans, though, is the fact that Peter Norman of Australia, who finished second in that race, wore a patch on his outfit in support of the Black athletes, not just Smith and Carlos, but Black athletes in general. And when he went back home to Australia, he was reviled and shunned by society. 4 years later, when he tried out for the 200 meters Olympic team in Australia again, he set a national record. He was not allowed to be on the team. And it was not until late in his life, and he died around 2012, it was not until late in Peter Norman's life that the Australian government finally apologized to the family. When he died in 2012, two of his pallbearers were John Carlos and Tommy Smith. They remained in touch with Norman's family between the Olympics up to that time, and they still remain in touch with Norman's family today. They refer to Norman as our brother. So, but then activism began to fade away among Black athletes. money started coming in into pro sports as television became more and more important. And so people like Magic Johnson and Michael Jordan, for example, were certainly idolized on the basketball court, but they didn't say anything controversial and and really were not politically active. Magic Johnson finally began to became important in Black communities in Los Angeles, first investments, movie theaters, what have you. But I have to point out that apparently did so only after he was being criticized, after he was criticized by Jim Brown for not being more active in the Black community. Jim Brown himself began to work with prisoners. He would go to prisons with the idea of preparing them for life after prison, how to manage your money, how to get a job, how to write a resume, whatever the case may be. And the large majority of the people that he worked with who left prison became successful after prison. Very few went back to prison after Jim Brown got involved. But Brown also pointed out that there are some people he knew that if he was ever going to have some sort of function to support Black people, he knew who not to call. Wilt Chamberlain, for example. And Brown understood Wilt. Wilt was a guy who lived in his own world, and Wilt was certainly comfortable around Black people. It wasn't about that. It was just much about that he just was not interested. He had his own life. O.J. Simpson was another. Brown regarded Simpson as a phony. And indeed, O.J. Simpson was not a person who Black people trusted. In general, Blacks did not trust O.J. Simpson. Whites did, Blacks did not. So when he was accused of killing his ex-wife and her alleged boyfriend, whites were shocked and disappointed. Blacks were not surprised. And indeed, O.J. Simpson, I guess, can be summed up in this way. Whenever he was in a movie, he always made sure he was the only Black person in the movie. So that was O.J. Simpson. So therefore now, and then Michael Jordan was another person who refused to use his position as a platform for the betterment of Black people. So, but then LeBron James came along, and really more than anyone else, LeBron was the one who really started this whole thing of becoming activist and using your voice. He understood that he had power. He understood he had a platform, and he used it. Steph Curry's another guy, that I really respect him for doing that. And so now what you're seeing today with the NBA postponing playoff games, and Major League Baseball postponing games, and the WNBA postponing games. I think they're in the playoffs as well, if I remember correctly. But the WNBA doing that, and even Major League Baseball. I think I mentioned baseball as well as soccer. That's right, I meant soccer. Doing the same thing here. I think that it is showing that the intersection of athletics and politics, something that have been there for a long time, is now being acknowledged publicly. And there's no way that people can sort of put that back in the bag again. For a long period of time, you have people saying that sports and politics don't mix. They've always mixed. But the problem people have had in the past was the fact that athletes were speaking up, they just wanted to go out there and play. As one person on the Fox News, said, just shut up and dribble. Well, that is something that just cannot be, and it never has been, and it never again will be.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I hate when people always complain about politics and sports. I mean, aside from that lull where money first started coming into sports and people realized that, the more controversy, the more you talk, the less money you're probably going to get. Aside from that, little period, I think that, it's evident that sports and politics have always been together or have always been intersected. And I think that that's the truth with, politics and race. I mean, I think that race, preceded the founding of the nation, and it's involved in everything we do. And sports was the first way that Black people got their platform. And it, for a lot of people, as long as there's inequality, for the most part, it'll be the only way that Black people will have the type of platform they need to cause change. So that's always kind of frustrating to me. Was that Jeffries versus Johnson fight the inspiration for the movie Great White Hype, or is that totally unrelated?
White Hope.
Great White Hope?
Hope.
Okay, Great White Hope. Okay. Oh, that was a Great White Hype. White Hope. All right.
That was a movie.
Yeah. Oh, is that so? Was he the Great White Hope? Jeffries was?
Jim Jeffries was the Great White Hope.
Okay.
Your movie, The Great White Hype, starred Samuel L. Jackson.
Okay, and that has Jamie Foxx and the Damon Wayans.
Yeah.
That movie's hilarious. But I think another thing that I want to talk about is I remember you probably told me this when we were like little kids. But it was after we seen that movie by oh man, can't forget his name. Spike Lee, Miracle at St. Anna. And there was a scene where they walk by a poster of Joe Louis, and they refer to his nickname the Brown Bomber. Was that nickname put on him by the white public to kind of remind or to, I guess, draw attention to the fact that he is black, that he's not white, or
Newspapers always, if you were black, they always remind the public that you were black.
Mm-hmm.
So Lewis was the Brown Bomber. He was the sepia, or whatever, which means brown, I guess. He was the Negro fighter, or the Negro champion. There was always, seemingly almost always, some sort of reminder of his skin color before mentioning his name. Even if it just happened once in an article. The Brown Bomber, Joe Louis, blah 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 blah. So yeah, that was done by the media.
Oh, all right. And okay, I guess that's really it then. I think that it's interesting when we talked about in the past how, when necessary, politicians will rally around race as they bring them on when they need them, whether it's for, votes, whether it's to fight in wars. And then after their usage is over or done, they kind of cast them aside or let them go back to the shadows without any, true type of reward or social.
On which side you're on, because on the one hand, you have politicians, especially at the presidential level, who will invoke race as a bad thing. That is, in 1988, for example, there was a black convict named Willie Horton who, on some sort of release program, left prison and killed somebody. So that was used to scare white people about what would happen if the Democratic candidate Michael Dukakis was elected president. When in 1996, I believe it was, North Carolina's Senator Jesse Helms, one of the biggest racists in history of that governing body, was losing in polls to a black man named Harvey Gantt, and so Helms went ahead and released some incredibly racist commercials, which then mobilized racist whites, and Helms therefore was reelected. This happened all the time, and presidential candidates for years invoked the specter of race and the dangers of dangerous qualities of black people in order to get white people to support them. On the other hand, as you're pointing out, there are situations where people make promises to the black population. I will work with you, I will help you, whatever. And as you point out, once they're elected, that's it. And the reason for that, sometimes it's racism, sometimes it's practicality. There are more white voters than black voters. And they're counting. This is what Donald Trump is doing right now. He is counting on racism to win this election. Racism and lies to win this election. And so, but I think that in that sense, it's kind of a losing proposition. I hope, because the public is waking up to what has been happening. You know, the problem is that racism is a very uncomfortable topic, and people do not want to discuss, feelings that they may have that they're deep down inside they know is wrong. They know the feeling is wrong. They know racism is wrong. They know racism is bad. And so they're uncomfortable with discussing it because it may mean confronting their own prejudices and beliefs. And we're all uncomfortable doing that. But again, but as long as you ignore it, then it'll last. So it has to be discussed and action has to be taken. And people have to recognize that, confronting whatever your own feelings may be is not a bad thing. You're very lucky, and I'm very lucky. You have white friends, you have black friends, and the one thing that they all have in common is that they're very comfortable with themselves, and they're very honest with themselves, and frankly, they just happen to like people. But you also have people who have these feelings, who are therefore uncomfortable with their own feelings, and may well be some sort of personal insecurities as well. That's the root of racism. So your own insecurities. Same thing with sexism. It's about insecurity. So among other things, but it begins there. So I think so. Yeah. So politicians took it both ways. And sometimes you have politicians saying one thing in one group and different thing in another group, and then their actions then pretty much indicate where they stood all along.
It's definitely a lot harder to do that these days with technology and all that coverage they get. But I guess what I was getting at was it's very similar, taking that into account, the utilization of, blacks and race in politics, but also you have that same type of concept with sports and athletes. So when they all rallied behind, it was Joe Louis for, that fight against Schmeling, because it was now you're one of us, we need you now. And he was
right.
Yeah. And then same thing with Jesse Owens. I mean, I heard at least from what I know, Jesse Owens is kind of a jerk, but they rallied around him once again, because now he's one of us when we need him to be one of us. But when they, same thing with blacks that came back from World War II, Joe Louis after the fight, Jesse Owens after the Olympics, when you come back, if you're seeing with the white woman, you're still going to get it. I think that it's just a universal thing. You embrace them when you need them and you don't when you don't. And I think that it's funny with the shut up and dribble concept. Are you allowed to be more than an athlete? And obviously, like today, they're not gonna not let themselves be empowered. But it's just really interesting, at least on social media, when I see whenever LeBron James says anything or the NBA steps up about domestic issues on race and equality and justice and all that stuff. You only see people bring up the China incident where, a year ago, all this from Hong Kong. And I'll be the first one to say, LeBron James, the NBA, definitely handled that wrong. They're still handling that wrong. But to let that in, I still think, we all know why. It's all financial. I still think to this day that the NBA told everyone to shut up on it.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, as powerful as LeBron James is, the NBA would still survive without him. And he needs the NBA, and NBA needs China. And so when people use that to, I guess, disempower the athletes on their causes here, to me, those are the same people who weren't going to support the cause anyways. And it's just funny when you look at those people who are from what I've personally observed, there's a correlation between people who discredit what the NBA is taking a stand on domestically because of China, and people who have always been saying America first for the last 4 years. Right. And it's just one of those things where the world's full of hypocrisy. But for the some people who are mad at LeBron and NBA for not speaking on China, they literally only care about China when they're trying to make that point. It's just, it's a lot of nitpicking. And I think that goes back to when you do have those insecurities and you feel uncomfortable talking about race and you're trying to avoid it, anything to discredit the people trying to make you confront it, or anything that makes you feel like you're in the right, you're going to hang on to. And I think that we see that with Herschel Walker, for example. We're talking about, athletes getting involved in politics, or athletes, or, being intersectioned with politics. And, every single person who has been anti, NBA protests, who's been anti Kaepernick taking a knee, who's been pro-Trump, essentially, like the amount of people who shared that one, like, quote by him, by Herschel Walker, who was employed by Trump, saying that, oh, Trump's not a racist and everything. They're rallying behind him because he's their token black friend who makes them feel like they're not wrong. And when you have that one black guy saying you're not racist, you're going to hold on to that one black guy and ignore the thousands of other black people who are, millions really, who are saying he's racist or you're racist, because that makes you feel more secure about your position, or to get rid of all doubts. And I think that's another way in which a black athlete is intersecting with politics and is essentially being used, because I know for a fact that none of these people cared about Herschel Walker prior to him making them feel good about themselves. And it's
I agree. The thing about it is that you're talking about politicians. When Robert Kennedy was a senator, and he ran for president as a senator in New York, and he was probably one of the very few politicians out there who was willing to discuss race, and and he did so in a year that was quite turbulent when he was assassinated in 1968, and but you fast forward though to various politicians. And for the most part, they're pretty quiet about all this, which is why, again, the athlete is so important here, because they're the ones who really sort of leading the way. And I think you get to a point now where athletes are going to have to be the leaders when it comes to this, because of the fact that politicians, many of them, are so concerned about the next election, they're not going to do anything or say anything that's controversial. I had to laugh when I saw that. Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, made a comment about how, besides, they can afford to lose a paycheck, which, they're not losing a paycheck, they're still going to play.
Yeah.
But he was talking about how Trump is willing to meet with them if the athletes come with something that's constructive to solve this. And besides the fact that the athletes have come up with suggestions, it's just that none of them enacted. And this is more of a ploy by Kushner to put the onus on the athletes. They want to meet with them, but if they don't, they say, well, we offered, that kind of thing. So I think, though, but your point about the Herschel Walkers of the world, a very good one. We've seen that time and time again, not only in this venue, but in others as well. The whole idea of I'm not racist because I have a black friend. So you have so you always have that kind of thing here. But what has to be done, though, is to have people understand that it involves more than just having a so-called black friend.
Oh yeah, it's annoying as hell. I think it's interesting that you had those athletes who had the platform before, money started really rolling in the 80s, specifically NBA players. And you could make the case, or kind of point to the fact that the reason why they didn't speak up was because they were getting money. But now the fact they have all this money, and LeBron James has been kind of the driving force behind this, and also he's kind of laid out this model or the mold for the modern athlete to, I guess, be their own business. He has his own production company now. Everyone is doing that. You have investments. I mean, the guy's he brought his gang along, or he brought his friends along, and instead of, taking care of them 100%, he set them up. And now they're all just kind of creating essentially this mini empire of theirs. But I guess what I'm getting at is that the money that silenced, I guess, black athletes or incentivized them to be quiet is the reason why they'll have to continue talking now, and is the reason why they are as influential as they are now, because the fact that there's so much capital on their shoulders, or they are literally like human capital walking around. And if you and obviously the strike they went on with the playoff games to put pressure on the owners to do something, the same owners that never really opened their checkbooks. I mean, the thing everyone was talking about was, I guess when the season got canceled, you had Zion Williams, who's a rookie, paid like the salary of all like the staff members for like a month or something like that, and the $3 billion owner did not. Like it's one of those things where it's you need these athletes who are making so much money for the owners and for white America to just stop doing it, like just go on a strike as anyone would, because unlike, I guess average people for the most part, they're not replaceable. Like you're not going to find a new LeBron James or a new basketball team to throw out there. You're just not going to do it. So I think it's really interesting how we see this evolution of, when you're starting, in the 80s, when you're starting to get all this human capital and start making money, you're quiet. And now that you have that human capital and you have that success and you are so important to capitalism, you have all this power, and that's going to encourage you to keep talking. And it's kind of interesting. Once again, we find these same themes, how, blacks were the backbone of the economy of the South in the 19th century, and before that with slavery, like they were the economy. And you can make the argument that obviously there are other things going on, but with specifically basketball and football being two of the biggest, most revenue-driven sports, and we'll talk about college later because that's just another mess with NCAA. But once again, they are a huge backbone of so many rich white people. Like they are the human labor that so many rich white people, that the rich people in the country rely on. And it's just, I don't know, these themes always come up. Like slavery went away, so I guess the importance of black people wasn't as pronounced, but clearly the impact they have on society and the economy are definitely felt today, just in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
that's here. One of the things that really helped today's athlete become more outspoken, especially NBA, is the multi-year contracts, big money multi-year contracts. Something that you pointed out, actually. But what you said, though, sort of reminded me of something. In the 1960s, Jim Brown spoke up. Bill Russell spoke up. I know the Cleveland Browns had a couple of guys speak up. And there are other players. Bobby Mitchell, who used to play with the Browns, was traded to Washington, was politically active. And then I also remember that there was a baseball player named Jim Bouton, wrote a book called Ball 4. Funny book. It was a great book, probably the best baseball book ever written. And Bouton was having a conversation with one of his teammates one day. They were talking about black players in baseball. And the point they were making was that these are white guys talking here, that that you could not be a mediocre player in Major League Baseball and be black. They mentioned that the Detroit Tigers had 3 black players on the team during this period of time. This is like the early 70s. And they pointed out that 2 of the black players, the Tigers, were stars. And the third one, a guy named Gates Brown, I think it was Gates Brown, was the best pinch hitter in the game. And the point here was that if you're black and mediocre, you're not going to make it. So you had to be a great player to be black and make it in Major League Baseball. And the one thing, all these, as I start out with football, then I came to baseball. And the one thing to keep in mind here, besides the fact that times were different, admittedly, was that sports in those days did not have free agency. And players, generally speaking, went on 1-year contracts. So your season finished up, and now you got to negotiate the next contract. And, I remember a case with Mickey Mantle, the Yankees, Hall of Fame center fielder, won the Triple Crown in the mid-1950s. He had a monster year. And the Yankees, realizing that Mantle, and again, 1-year contracts, no free agency, so you basically stuck with what ownership offered, unless you're willing to sit out. The Yankees, realized that Mantle was going to ask for a big raise, hired a private detective to follow him, and the detective discovered that Mantle was cheating on his wife. And they got pictures. So when it came time to negotiate the contract for the next year, Mantle wanted a big pay raise. The Yankees offered him a 10% pay cut. And when Mantle balked at that, they showed him pictures of he and this other woman. Accept the pay cut or your wife gets these pictures. So Mantle took the pay cut. And so if you were a player, if you were an athlete in those days, professional athlete in those days, you were really stuck. And if you were a black person and you were a mediocre ball player and you spoke out, you were done. And so the only people who spoke out in this case were the stars. Jim Brown, Bill Russell, John Wooten, Bobby Mitchell. The stars spoke out because they could afford to speak out. So one of the benefits of free agency was that players started getting multi-year contracts, big money contracts, and except for the NFL, guaranteed contracts. And so it took a while, but it put them all in positions where they could speak up. Because the truth of the matter is, everybody wants talent. If my team doesn't want me, they're going to cut me because I said something, somebody else will take me. The one exception being Colin Kaepernick, who was blackballed by the league. And so, but other than that, though, that's the way things were in those days. One-year contracts, low salaries, so players really could not afford to speak up. Jim Brown was making six figures with the Browns. He could speak up because, the Browns are not about to go and antagonize Jim Brown. And the Celtics are not about to antagonize Bill Russell. But if you're just an average player, we don't really need you.
Yeah, I mean, Jim Brown, I feel like I think Jim Brown I always had mixed emotions about Jim Brown, given his his activism was great, but his off-field other issues, I think would have put him under the worst of spotlights in today's society, at least social media.
Yeah, but the thing about it is that he there were some things he did that he shouldn't have done regarding women. In some of the cases he denied having done that, and so did actually some of the women, but you just don't know those situations.
Uh-huh.
But I balance that. Well, I don't excuse things that he allegedly did. On the other hand, he got kids out of gangs. He eliminated a lot of gangs, really, and without any help. He worked with people in prisons. As a matter of fact, about 15 years ago, he went to Connecticut to meet with prisoners in Cheshire, at the prison in Cheshire. And I had him meet with some of my students, actually. And, so I get what you're saying, but he did so much to help people prepare for life, get them out of gangs. You get a gang member, got a girl pregnant, you tell them, marry that girl and get a job. The kid got out of the, and he can back down from people. That was the whole thing too. He just did not back down from people. So, but Brown still though was a person who was again politically active, and at a time when most people were not.
Yeah. And contextually, I guess women's rights always kind of came behind race relations. But even I think about obviously the Celtics were going to antagonize Bill Russell, but Bill Russell had to endure with that fan base and those stories are wild.
Members of the Celtics part of the Ku Klux Klan. They never mentioned who, but he has said that and dealing with those fans in Boston. Yeah, it's rough because he really had to deal with some crazy folks in Boston.
Yeah, I mean, I think Boston fans are definitely up there pretty bad. I don't think they're the worst. I just think there's so many of them that, it just seems like percentage-wise they're worse. But I always think that, Boston's still a pretty, it's a cultural epicenter. So I don't think it's as bad as it seems. It's just a lot. But definitely a few places that I think of when I think of, if I was a professional athlete, if I was ever that gifted to be a professional athlete, places I would avoid. But yeah, so I think that's it as far as athletes and politics. What?
That is, black athletes had written in contracts, especially baseball players, that they could not be treated with the Boston Red Sox.
That's also true. I remember that's actually still a thing. I remember, was it Andrew Jones, like 2-3 years ago, came out and said that was something that he made sure was in his contract still? Andrew Jones.
And Ken Griffey Jr., A whole bunch of them. I mean, you have maybe a dozen or more.
Yeah, but to be fair, not to be fair, but to counterpoint that, I'm sure if Utah had a baseball team, they get the exact same treatment. Like, and that's kind of like.
I don't know. I think Boston fans are much more rambunctious than they are in Houston. I'll use that term. Much more rambunctious.
That's fair. All right.
Anyway,
this is another conversation we have, but I mean I think those great states out there, that big empty zone between, I guess, Chicago and California, that area just kind of freaks me out a little bit. But yeah, all right. So let's get to going on the Supreme Court case. This one here, I'm going to stop the recording real quick, or I'll pause. Now I'll just cut it up later.